Picture this. It's 1924, the White House, middle of the afternoon, and the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, is fast asleep in his bedroom. Not because of some medical emergency, not because he'd been up all night handling a crisis. No, he's napping. Just napping. Because that's what he does, every single day, without fail. His name was Calvin Coolidge, and he might be the most peculiar president in American history. Not because of scandal, not because of controversy, but because this man treated the presidency like it was an extended vacation that occasionally interrupted his sleep schedule. We're talking about a president who slept 11 hours every night, who took a 2 to 4 hour nap every afternoon, who by conservative estimates spent somewhere between 60 and 70% of his presidency either asleep or lying in bed. A man so committed to rest that he once fell asleep during a meeting with a foreign dignitary, and nobody was surprised. A president so quiet, so still, so fundamentally uninterested in the chaos of governing that Americans nicknamed him Silent Cal and somehow loved him for it. This is the story of how one man napped his way through the Roaring Twenties, presided over unprecedented economic prosperity while barely staying conscious, and left office just months before everything collapsed into the Great Depression. It's the story of America's sleepiest president, and somehow one of its most popular. Let's start at the beginning, not with grand ambitions or political dreams, but with a man who fundamentally did not want to be bothered. Calvin Coolidge was born on July 4th, 1872, in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Already we're dealing with a man born on America's birthday, in one of the most aggressively American-sounding towns in existence. You'd think this would create some sense of destiny, some burning desire to lead. You'd be wrong. Young Calvin was quiet, painfully quiet, the kind of kid who made teachers uncomfortable because he'd sit there, perfectly still, saying nothing, just existing. His classmates would run around during recess, shouting and playing games, and Calvin would sit under a tree, watching them like he was studying a foreign species, not judging them, not wishing he could join, just observing, silent, already practicing for a lifetime of saying as little as humanly possible. His father, John Calvin Coolidge Sr., ran a general store in Plymouth Notch, the kind of small-town Vermont store where everyone knew everyone, and conversations could stretch for hours about nothing in particular. Young Calvin would help out at the store, and customers quickly learned not to expect much chit-chat from the Coolidge boy. He'd get you what you needed, take your money, give you change, and maybe, grunt a goodbye if you were lucky. His mother Victoria was the warm one, the one who'd actually talk to you, who'd ask how you were doing, who'd show interest in your life. She died when Calvin was 12 years old, and by most accounts, whatever small spark of openness he'd possessed died with her. He retreated into himself, became even more withdrawn, more reserved. His sister Abigail died a few years later, and Calvin just shut down even more. Grief does strange things to people. For some, it opens them up, makes them reach out for connection. For Calvin, it was like someone had built a wall around him, brick by brick, until he was completely sealed off from the world. He didn't talk about his feelings, didn't cry, didn't rage. He just became quieter, stiller, more like a statue than a teenage boy. He went to Amherst College in Massachusetts, and if you're thinking college would loosen him up, make him more social, help him come out of his shell, you'd be wrong again. Calvin arrived at Amherst as a silent, awkward Vermont farm boy, and he left as a silent, awkward Vermont farm boy with a degree. 4 years of higher education, and he emerged basically unchanged. There's a story from his college years that perfectly captures who Calvin Coolidge was. During a philosophy class, the professor was trying to get students to debate, to argue passionately about some theoretical point regarding ethics and morality. Every other student was engaged, talking, gesturing, getting heated about whatever abstract concept they were supposed to be discussing. Calvin sat silently, staring at his desk. Finally, the frustrated professor pointed at him and demanded, "Mr. Coolidge, what do you think about this matter?" Calvin looked up slowly, paused for what felt like an eternity, and said, "I don't think," then went back to staring at his desk. The professor, probably thinking this was some kind of philosophical statement, pressed him. "You don't think? What do you mean by that, Calvin?" "I mean, I don't think about it, Professor." "But surely you must have some opinion, Calvin." "Nope." And that was the end of that. The professor gave up. You couldn't extract words from Calvin Coolidge if you used pliers and a crowbar. He simply refused to participate in the verbal world more than absolutely necessary. His classmates found him bizarre. Not mean or unpleasant, just weird. He'd sit in the corner during social gatherings, not drinking, not talking, just watching everyone else like he was an anthropologist studying college students in their natural habitat. Sometimes people would try to engage him in conversation, and it would go like this. "Hey Cal, did you hear about—" "Yep." "What do you think?" "Don't." "You going to the—" "Nope." And that would be it. Conversation over. Calvin had used up his word quota for the hour, but somehow, despite being the most socially awkward person at Amherst, Calvin graduated with honours. He was smart, sharp even. He just saw no reason to advertise that fact by talking about it. He studied law after graduation, got admitted to the Massachusetts bar, and set up practice in Northampton. A small-town lawyer for a small-town boy, it seemed like Calvin's destiny was to live a quiet, unremarkable life in a quiet, unremarkable place. And then he got into politics, because of course he did, because nothing makes sense about Calvin Coolidge's life. He started small, city council in Northampton, then city solicitor, then state representative, then state senator, then lieutenant governor, then governor of Massachusetts, all while maintaining the personality of a man attending his own funeral. He'd show up to political events, stand in the corner, say almost nothing, and somehow people kept electing him to higher offices. Why? Part of it was that Calvin looked the part. He was neat, clean, professional. He dressed conservatively, carried himself with dignity, and had the kind of face that looked trustworthy even if it barely moved. In photographs from this era, Calvin has the same expression in every single one, slightly grim, mildly uncomfortable, like someone just told him he had to be in another photograph. But the bigger reason people kept electing him was that he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He didn't give flowery speeches about transforming government or solving all of society's problems. He'd show up, say something like, "I believe in being careful with public money," in the flattest possible tone, and then shut up. In a world of politicians who never stopped talking, Calvin's silence seemed almost refreshing. He married Grace Goodhue in 1905, and even that courtship has a perfectly Coolidge story attached to it. Grace was a teacher at the Clark School for the Deaf in Northampton. One morning, she was watering flowers outside her window when she looked up and saw a man in a window across the way. This man was shaving, normal enough, except he was wearing a hat and long underwear and nothing else. Grace burst out laughing. The absurdity of it, this grown man, shaving in a hat and underwear, was too much. The man looked over, saw her laughing, and didn't react at all, just kept shaving. That man was Calvin Coolidge, and that absurd image, that moment of pure ridiculousness, was apparently enough to spark a romance. They met properly soon after, and Grace quickly realised what she was getting into. Calvin was not a talker. He was not romantic in any conventional sense. Their courtship consisted mostly of them sitting together while Calvin said almost nothing and Grace chatted away, trying to fill the silence. But there was something about him, some quality beneath the silence, that appealed to her. Maybe she saw kindness there. Maybe she appreciated that he actually listened, even if he never responded with more than a grunt. They got married, and Grace Coolidge spent the next several decades becoming one of history's most patient women. She was warm, sociable, charming, funny. She could work a room while Calvin stood in the corner, looking like he was calculating the quickest escape route. She'd tell stories and jokes at dinner parties while Calvin sat silently, occasionally nodding, mostly just eating. She was everything he wasn't. And somehow it worked. Mostly because Grace understood that Calvin's silence wasn't coldness. It was just who he was. He showed affection in his own way. Small gestures, making sure she was comfortable, remembering things she mentioned once in passing. He loved her. He just expressed it the way a very quiet rock might express love for the sun, silently, through presence rather than words. They had 2 sons, John and Calvin Jr. The boys were more like their mother, livelier, more talkative, which was good because if they'd inherited their father's personality, family dinners would have consisted of 4 people sitting in absolute silence, occasionally passing the salt. As Calvin climbed the political ladder in Massachusetts, city council, state legislature, lieutenant governor, people kept waiting for him to become more dynamic, more presidential, more anything. Instead, he became more Calvin, more quiet, more still, more committed to the philosophy that the best government was the government that did the least. Then came 1919 and the Boston police strike, and suddenly everyone was paying attention to the silent governor from Vermont. The Boston police strike was a big deal. Police officers walked off the job, demanding better pay and working conditions. Boston descended into chaos, looting, riots, violence. People were scared. The mayor was ineffective. Everyone looked to Governor Coolidge to do something. And Calvin, shockingly, did something. He called out the National Guard. He broke the strike. He refused to negotiate with the police union. And when Samuel Gompers, head of the American Federation of Labor, sent him a telegram asking him to reconsider, Calvin responded with a telegram that became famous. There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime. 14 words, probably the longest sentence Calvin had said in public in years, and those 14 words made him a national figure. People were shocked, not by his actions, by the fact that Silent Cal had taken any action at all. Here was this quiet, seemingly passive man who'd suddenly shown a backbone, who'd been decisive, who'd done the one thing everyone thought he couldn't do: lead. The truth was, Calvin had always been decisive. He just saved his decisions for when they actually mattered. The rest of the time, he saw no reason to waste energy on things that would probably resolve themselves. But that moment of leadership, that brief flash of actual presidential behaviour, was enough to get him noticed nationally. The Republican Party was looking ahead to the 1920 election, and they needed a vice presidential candidate to balance out their presidential nominee, Warren G. Harding. Harding was everything Calvin wasn't. Handsome, charismatic, friendly, The kind of politician who could shake hands and tell jokes and make everyone in the room feel like his best friend. He was from Ohio, he loved poker and whiskey, and surrounding himself with friends who would eventually scandalize his administration with corruption. He was the front man, the face of the ticket. Calvin was picked as his running mate for a few reasons. He was from New England, which balanced Harding's Midwest roots. He was respectable and clean, with no hint of scandal. He'd shown leadership during the Boston police strike, and most importantly, he wasn't likely to cause any problems or demand attention. They won in a landslide. Harding and Coolidge, 1920, and Calvin Coolidge became Vice President of the United States, a position that would allow him to perfect the art of doing absolutely nothing. The vice presidency in the 1920s was even more of a ceremonial nothing job than it is today. The VP had basically two responsibilities: presiding over the Senate, which mostly meant sitting in a chair and occasionally banging a gavel and not dying so the president wouldn't have to find a replacement. Calvin was perfect for it. He'd show up to the Senate, sit silently, occasionally recognize someone who wanted to speak, and otherwise just exist. Senators would give long, passionate speeches about important issues, and Calvin would sit there with the same expression he always had, slightly grim, mildly uncomfortable, like he was wondering when he could go home. There's a story about a senator who gave a particularly long-winded speech, hours and hours of oratory about some piece of legislation. When he finally finished and sat down, expecting some acknowledgement from the vice president, Calvin just said, "Objection noted." That was it. No comment on the content, no praise for the effort, just confirmation that yes, he had registered that sound had occurred. Calvin attended Harding's cabinet meetings, but almost never spoke. He'd sit there, listening to various secretaries discuss policy and contribute nothing. Harding once asked him directly, "What do you think, Mr. Vice President?" Calvin looked at him and said, "I don't think." Harding laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. But Calvin did his job. He showed up. He was present. He was the most present absence in American politics. Everyone knew where Calvin Coolidge was at any given time. Sitting somewhere, silent, probably thinking about his next nap. Because yes, even as vice president, Calvin maintained his legendary sleep schedule. 11 hours at night, 2 to 4 hours in the afternoon. His staff learned to work around it. Appointments were scheduled in the morning or late afternoon. If someone needed to meet with the vice president between 1 and 4 p.m., the answer was simple. No. Grace was now second lady, which meant hosting events and being social and charming, while Calvin stood nearby looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. She excelled at it. She was funny and warm, and put people at ease. Calvin's contribution to these events was showing up and occasionally nodding when someone said something to him. There's a famous story from this period about a dinner party at the vice president's residence. A young woman was seated next to Calvin, and she told him she'd made a bet with her friends that she could get him to say more than 2 words during dinner. Calvin looked at her, completely deadpan, and said, "You lose," then went back to eating in silence. The woman sat there for the rest of the meal, stunned, while Calvin methodically worked through his food without saying another word. Grace across the table probably wasn't even surprised. That was just Calvin being Calvin. Harding, meanwhile, was being Harding, playing poker with his friends, making backroom deals, surrounding himself with people who would eventually be revealed as corrupt. The Teapot Dome scandal was brewing. The Veterans Bureau scandal was brewing. Harding's administration was becoming a mess of corruption and incompetence, and Calvin Coolidge was sitting to the side, silent, probably asleep during half of it. Then on August 2nd, 1923, Warren G. Harding died, suddenly, in San Francisco, officially from a heart attack, though there have been conspiracy theories ever since suggesting everything from poisoning to suicide. Whatever the cause, Harding was dead, and Calvin Coolidge was about to become president. And the way he found out is so perfectly, absurdly Calvin that it almost seems like a setup. Calvin was on vacation in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, his boyhood home. No electricity, no telephone, just oil lamps and the kind of rural isolation that seems impossible for a vice president of the United States. But that was Calvin. He didn't need modern conveniences. He didn't need to be connected to the world. He just needed quiet and a comfortable bed. He'd gone to bed early that night, probably around 9 p.m., sleeping soundly in the same house where he'd grown up, in the same room where his mother had tucked him in as a child. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, the president was dying, and nobody could reach the vice president because he was asleep in a house without a phone. A telegram was sent to the nearest town with telegraph service, Bridgewater, Vermont, about 7 miles away. The telegraph operator there tried to call Plymouth Notch, realized there was no phone line, and had to wake up a man named Willard Kimball, who owned one of the only cars in the area. Kimball drove through the night on dark country roads to deliver the message. They arrived at the Coolidge house around 2:30 in the morning, pounded on the door. Calvin's father answered, still in his nightshirt, confused about who would be making such a racket at this hour. They told him, "President Harding is dead. Your son is now president." John Coolidge went upstairs and woke Calvin, shook him awake. "Calvin, Calvin, wake up. The president is dead." Calvin opened his eyes, completely calm. "Dead?" "Yes, you're president now." Calvin thought about this for a moment, then said, "I believe I can take the oath of office," like he was agreeing to help move furniture or something. They went downstairs to the sitting room. Calvin's father, who was a notary public, got out the family Bible. A few reporters who'd followed Kimball stood around with cameras, and at 2:47 a.m., by the light of a kerosene lamp in a small Vermont farmhouse, John Calvin Coolidge Sr. administered the oath of office to his son. Calvin placed his hand on the Bible, the same Bible his mother had read to him as a child. He repeated the words in his flat Vermont accent, and just like that, he became the 30th President of the United States. Then he went back to bed. Not for a few minutes, not to close his eyes briefly. He went back upstairs, got back into bed, and slept until morning. Because in his words, he thought he could do no more that night. The man had just become leader of the free world, commander-in-chief of the military, the most powerful person on the planet. And his immediate thought was, well, nothing I can do about it right now. Might as well sleep. This was not an anomaly. This was not shock or grief making him act strangely. This was pure Calvin Coolidge. He'd been woken up at 2:47 a.m., which was deeply inconvenient to his sleep schedule. The respectful thing to do was take the oath. Yes, absolutely. But then, back to bed. Morning would come soon enough, and he could deal with being president then. Grace, when she found out in the morning, probably just sighed and started planning how she'd manage being First Lady, married to a man who treated the presidency like an inconvenient interruption to his nap schedule. When Calvin Coolidge moved into the White House in August 1923, he didn't change his habits to fit the presidency. He changed the presidency to fit his habits, and his primary habit was sleep. 11 hours a night, every night. He'd go to bed around 10 p.m., sometimes earlier, if he was particularly tired or if there was nothing interesting happening, which was most nights. He wouldn't emerge until 9 a.m., Not 7 a.m. like most presidents, not even 8 a.m. 9 in the morning, and even then he'd shuffle around in his pajamas for a while, eating a slow breakfast, reading the newspaper, generally not being in any hurry to start his day. White House staff had to adjust their entire schedule around the president's sleep. Morning meetings couldn't start before 10 a.m. at the earliest. Evening events had to end by 9 p.m. or Calvin would just leave, regardless of who was still there or what was being discussed. He had a bedtime, and he stuck to it like his life depended on it. But that was just the foundation. The real commitment to rest came in the afternoons. Every single day without exception, Calvin would eat lunch, return to his bedroom, put on his pajamas, yes, special sleeping pajamas that were different from his morning pajamas, and sleep for 2 to 4 hours, sometimes longer if he was particularly tired or particularly uninterested in whatever was on his schedule that afternoon. This wasn't a quick power nap. This was full deep REM cycle sleep. Calvin would close his bedroom door, draw the curtains, and disappear from the world for hours. The President of the United States, the leader of the free world, was completely unreachable from approximately 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. every single day. White House staff learned to work around it quickly. Meetings were scheduled in the morning or late afternoon. Important decisions were delayed until after nap time. Foreign dignitaries were warned in advance. The president sleeps from 1 to 4. Plan accordingly. We're very sorry, but this is non-negotiable. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but absolutely in character, about a senator who demanded an urgent meeting with the president. It was 2 p.m. The president's secretary explained as calmly as possible that Mr. Coolidge was sleeping and could not be disturbed under any circumstances. The senator was indignant. "This is a matter of national importance." The secretary: "The president is asleep, Senator. Wake him up. This can't wait." Secretary: "The president has given strict instructions that he is not to be disturbed during his rest period. You'll have to come back after 4 o'clock. Senator: "This is outrageous. I'm a United States Senator. I demand." Secretary: "The president is asleep. You can demand whatever you'd like, but he won't hear you because he's unconscious in his bedroom." The senator left fuming. He came back at 4:30 p.m. Calvin saw him, listened to his urgent national crisis, and said something like, "I'll think about it," before dismissing him. The crisis, whatever it was, resolved itself without presidential intervention. Calvin's nap had been more important. His physician, Dr. Joel Boone, was interviewed years later about the president's health habits. Boone said, and this is a direct quote, that Calvin Coolidge slept more than any human being he'd ever encountered in his medical practice. 11 hours at night, 2 to 4 hours every afternoon, occasional evening naps if he was feeling drowsy after dinner. Boone did the math. By his estimate, Calvin spent between 60 and 70% of his presidency asleep. More time unconscious than conscious. More time in bed than out of it. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. The President of the United States was literally asleep for more than half of his term in office. Not metaphorically asleep, not disengaged or distracted, actually physically unconscious, dreaming whatever it is that silent presidents dream, and the country loved him for it. See, here's the thing about the 1920s. America was booming. The economy was roaring. The stock market was climbing. Production was up. Wages were up. Everything was up. It was called the Roaring Twenties for a reason. Jazz music, flapper dresses, speakeasies hidden in every city, Hollywood turning into a dream factory, cars rolling off assembly lines, radios in every home, bringing the world into your living room. America was having a party, the biggest, loudest, most excessive party in the nation's history, and the last thing Americans wanted was a president who'd interfere with that party. Calvin Coolidge's entire political philosophy can be summed up in one sentence. He actually said, "The business of America is business." That was it. That was his governing ideology. Government should stay out of the way. Taxes should be low. Regulations should be minimal. Let capitalism do its thing. Let the market work its magic. And the president should, well, sleep. This wasn't laziness exactly. It was ideology. Calvin genuinely believed, deeply, fundamentally believed, that the best thing a president could do was nothing, or as close to nothing as humanly possible, while still technically performing the duties of the office. He'd veto bills that increased government spending. He'd refuse to expand federal programs. He'd appoint business-friendly officials to regulatory positions and then let them do whatever they wanted. Under Coolidge, the government didn't grow, it shrank. Budgets were cut, departments were streamlined. The federal government, under Calvin Coolidge, got smaller and less intrusive, which was exactly what he wanted. And for a while, for the mid-1920s at least, it seemed to work. The economy kept growing, unemployment stayed low, the stock market kept climbing, people were making money. Not everyone, but enough people that it felt like prosperity was everywhere. Calvin's approval ratings were excellent. People genuinely liked him. Not because he was doing anything, but because he wasn't doing anything. After the corruption of the Harding administration, after the upheaval of World War I and its aftermath, Americans wanted stability, predictability, quiet, and Calvin Coolidge was the quietest man in America. His speeches were famously short. He'd stand at a podium, say a few sentences about limited government and fiscal responsibility in his flat, nasal Vermont accent, and then sit down. People would wait for more. There wasn't more. That was the whole speech. His press conferences, yes, he held regular press conferences, which seems insane given his personality, were exercises in saying as little as possible. Reporters would ask questions, and Calvin would respond with yes, no, don't know, or can't say. Sometimes he'd just stare at them until they got uncomfortable and asked a different question. One reporter asked him about some complex foreign policy situation. Calvin stared at him for a long moment, then said, "Don't know. Never thought about it." Reporter, "But surely you must have some opinion, Mr. President." Calvin, "Nope." Reporter, "Can you at least tell us if the administration is considering—" Calvin, "Can't say." Reporter, "Is that can't say as in you're not allowed to tell us, or can't say as in you don't know?" Calvin, "Both." And that was the end of the interview. The reporters would file out, barely having gotten anything usable for their stories, and Calvin would probably go take a nap. There's another story about a reporter who asked Calvin what he thought about some domestic policy issue. Calvin looked at him and said, "I think what I've always thought." The reporter waited for elaboration. There was no elaboration. Calvin had answered the question to his satisfaction and saw no need to continue. His wife Grace told a story about taking a walk with Calvin through Washington. They passed by a building under construction. Grace, trying to make conversation because someone had to fill the silence, said, "I wonder what they're building there." Calvin didn't respond. They walked another entire block in complete silence. Finally, Grace said, "Calvin, did you hear me?" Calvin, "Yes." Another block of silence. Grace, "Well, what are they building?" Calvin, "Building." Grace, "Yes, I know it's a building, but what kind of building?" Calvin, "Don't know." Grace, Should we find out? Calvin. Nope. And that was it. That was the extent of his engagement with the question. They're building a building. What else did she need to know? Why would they need to investigate further? It was a building. Buildings get built, mystery solved. Grace, bless her heart, had the patience of an absolute saint. She understood that Calvin's silence wasn't personal. She understood that he wasn't being deliberately difficult or obtuse. This was just who he was. Some people express themselves through words. Calvin expressed himself through the absence of words, through silence and stillness, and the occasional grunt of acknowledgement. She became the social face of the administration. She hosted events, charmed guests, made small talk, laughed at jokes, did all the things that first ladies were expected to do, while Calvin stood nearby looking like he was mentally calculating how many minutes until he could escape back to his bedroom. At White House dinners, Grace would be the centre of attention, telling stories, making everyone feel welcome and comfortable. Calvin would sit at the head of the table, eating methodically, contributing nothing to the conversation unless directly asked a question, and even then responding with the minimum number of words necessary. Mr. President, what do you think about the situation in Europe? Bad. Could you elaborate? Nope. Back to eating. Back to silence, while Grace kept the conversation flowing around him like he was a rock in a stream, and she was the water finding a way past the obstacle. But Calvin did have a lighter side. He just expressed it in the weirdest, most Calvin Coolidge ways possible. He loved practical jokes, not elaborate pranks or complex schemes, simple, childish, pointless jokes that only Calvin found funny. He'd ring all the White House bells at once just to watch Secret Service agents scramble around, trying to figure out what emergency was happening. When they'd burst into the room, ready to protect the president from some threat, Calvin would just be sitting there, completely deadpan, like he had no idea what they were talking about. He'd hide behind doors and jump out to startle people. Not with any particular enthusiasm. Calvin wasn't capable of enthusiasm. He'd just step out from behind a door and say boo in his flat monotone while the person jumped 3 feet in the air. Then he'd walk away without another word, satisfied that he'd completed his joke. One time he called for his bodyguard. The man came running, expecting some urgent matter requiring his attention. Calvin pointed at his own hat and said, "Hat, bodyguard." "Yes, sir, that's your hat." Calvin nodded, apparently satisfied, and walked away. That was the joke. That was the entire thing. He'd made the man run for no reason except to identify a hat. Calvin thought it was hilarious. The bodyguard probably questioned his life choices. He also had a mechanical horse installed in the White House that he'd ride for exercise. Just imagine, the President of the United States, in his bedroom, still wearing his pajamas, riding a fake horse that rocked back and forth. Probably with the same grim expression he always had, as if horseback riding were a solemn duty rather than something that should be even slightly fun. Secret Service agents would hear the creaking of the mechanical horse through the walls and just shake their heads. That was their president, riding his fake horse, in his pajamas, in the middle of the afternoon, when he should probably be governing. And then there were the animals. Calvin loved animals in a way that seemed completely at odds with his indifference to most humans. He had dogs, cats, birds, a donkey named Ebenezer, a bobcat, lion cubs that someone had gifted him from South Africa, a wallaby, a pygmy hippo named Billy. The White House during the Coolidge administration was basically a zoo where occasionally some governing happened between feeding times. But his most famous pet, the one that really captured the absurdity of the Calvin Coolidge presidency, was a raccoon named Rebecca. Someone had sent Rebecca to the White House to be Thanksgiving dinner. Yes, people ate raccoons in the 1920s, apparently. The raccoon arrived in a crate with a note explaining that she was intended to be cooked for the holiday meal. Grace took one look at Rebecca, this small, scared raccoon in a box, and refused to let her be eaten. So Rebecca became a pet. They built her a little house outside. She'd walk around the White House grounds on a leash. Calvin would let her ride on his shoulders. During walks, White House staff had to adjust to the fact that there was now a raccoon living with the president, and she had free reign of the place. There's an official photograph of President Calvin Coolidge standing on the White House lawn wearing a suit, with Rebecca the raccoon sitting on his shoulder. It's one of the most bizarre presidential photos in American history. Calvin looks completely comfortable, completely at ease. Like having a raccoon on your shoulder is the most natural thing in the world when you're leader of the free world. Rebecca would sometimes escape from her little house and cause chaos, climbing curtains, stealing food from the kitchen, generally acting like a wild animal that someone had inexplicably decided to domesticate. Staff would have to chase her through the White House while Calvin watched, presumably amused in his own silent way, before going back to his bedroom for his afternoon nap. The animals were the only things that seemed to bring out anything approaching warmth in Calvin. He'd actually talk to them. Not much, but more than he talked to most humans. He'd pet the dogs, feed the birds, check on Rebecca. These were his family in a way. They didn't expect him to make speeches or small talk. They just existed alongside him, which was all Calvin wanted from anyone. But let's talk about the sleeping, because that's really what defined the Coolidge presidency more than any policy or decision. Not legislation, not foreign affairs, not economic management. Sleep. The legendary, excessive, almost superhuman amount of sleep that Calvin Coolidge required to function. White House staff learned to tiptoe, literally tiptoe, around the executive residence between 1 and 4 p.m. Doors were closed softly so the sound wouldn't travel. Conversations were conducted in whispers. Construction projects on the White House grounds were scheduled for morning hours only. The entire executive branch essentially went on pause while the president recharged. Calvin didn't see anything wrong with this. In his view, most problems solved themselves if you just waited long enough. Why exhaust yourself dealing with issues that might not even exist by tomorrow? Better to rest, stay healthy, maintain your energy, and only act when absolutely necessary. His cabinet meetings were famously brief. He'd sit at the head of the table, listen to various secretaries present their departmental issues, and offer minimal input. Sometimes he'd nod. Sometimes he'd grunt. Sometimes he'd just stare at whoever was talking with an expression that could mean anything from thoughtful consideration to complete disinterest to actual unconsciousness, with his eyes open. And sometimes, more often than anyone would have liked, he'd actually fall asleep. Not even trying to hide it, not fighting to stay awake, just dozed off mid-meeting while someone was explaining agricultural policy or tariff regulations or the state of relations with some foreign nation. His aides learned to recognize the signs, the eyes getting heavy, the head starting to nod forward, the complete absence of any reaction to whatever was being said. They'd quietly wrap up the meeting, shepherd everyone out, and let the president rest. Someone would wake him an hour later, and he'd shuffle back to his actual bedroom for his proper afternoon nap. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but everyone who worked in the Coolidge White House agreed it was absolutely plausible, about Calvin falling asleep during a meeting with a foreign ambassador. The ambassador was presenting some important matter regarding trade relations or diplomatic protocols, or something equally dry. He was mid-sentence when he noticed the president's eyes were closed. Then he heard the snoring. The ambassador stopped talking, looked around at the American officials in the room. Everyone just sort of shrugged apologetically. This happened sometimes, nothing to be done about it. The ambassador sat there in increasingly awkward silence for 10 or 15 minutes, while the President of the United States softly snored. Finally, an aide noticed what had happened, quietly entered the room, and gently woke Calvin. The President opened his eyes, looked around like he'd just remembered where he was, and said, "Continue." The ambassador, completely flustered at this point, tried to pick up where he'd left off. Calvin listened for another 5 minutes, said, "I'll consider it," and ended the meeting. The ambassador left, probably composing a very interesting letter to his home government about the American president's unusual working habits. But here's the genuinely insane part. It worked. Or seemed to work, at least during Calvin's presidency. The economy kept growing. Unemployment stayed low. The stock market kept climbing. Corporate profits were soaring. Industrial production was through the roof. By every measure that mattered to most Americans in the 1920s, things were great, and Calvin Coolidge was sleeping through all of it. His approval ratings were consistently excellent. People genuinely liked him. Newspapers wrote affectionate profiles about Silent Cal and his quirks. He became a kind of folk hero, the quiet man from Vermont who'd stumbled into the presidency and decided the best way to handle it was to do as little as possible. There was something reassuring about it in a way. After Woodrow Wilson's intense, exhausting presidency, the war, the League of Nations fight, the stroke that incapacitated him, Americans were tired. They didn't want a president who'd demand things from them, who'd ask them to sacrifice, who'd try to reshape society. They wanted to be left alone. Calvin Coolidge was happy to leave them alone. He was happy to leave everyone alone. His entire presidency was basically him saying, "You do your thing, I'll do mine, and my thing is sleeping." He was re-elected in 1924 in a landslide. His campaign strategy was essentially, "I'm not going to change anything. I'm barely going to be awake. Vote for me." And America looked at the prosperity of the mid-1920s and said, "Sure, let's keep the sleepy guy. He's not breaking anything." His campaign didn't hold many rallies. He didn't give many speeches. He just sort of existed. Let his record of sleeping through economic prosperity speak for itself. The Democrats ran John W. Davis, a perfectly respectable candidate who gave passionate speeches about various issues. Calvin gave one speech where he said something like, "Things are good, let's keep them that way," and then went home to nap. Calvin won 54% of the popular vote and 382 electoral votes. Davis got 136 electoral votes and probably much less sleep. Even Calvin's political opponents couldn't quite figure out how to attack him. How do you criticize a man for sleeping? How do you attack someone whose entire political philosophy is leave everything alone? They tried to paint him as lazy, as indifferent, as disconnected from the struggles of ordinary Americans. They pointed out that while he slept, real problems were growing. Income inequality, agricultural depression, speculative excess in the stock market, but Calvin would just shrug, if he responded at all, and go back to bed. And somehow that made him seem above the fray, too dignified to engage with petty political squabbling, a man of such quiet confidence that he didn't need to defend himself. The press loved him, in their way, not because he gave them good quotes, he gave them almost no quotes, not because he was accessible, he was asleep for half the day, but because he was such a character, Such a strange, inexplicable presence in American politics. They wrote feature stories about his sleeping habits, his silence, his weird pets, his practical jokes. Calvin Coolidge wasn't exciting, but he was fascinating in his complete lack of excitement. One journalist wrote, "The president sleeps more than any man in Washington, and yet somehow remains the most wakeful presence in American politics." Which was a very poetic way of saying, we have no idea how this is working, but somehow it is. There's a story about a young reporter who was assigned to shadow the president for a day and write a profile piece. The reporter showed up at the White House at 9 a.m. Calvin was still in his morning pajamas, eating breakfast slowly, reading 3 or 4 different newspapers simultaneously. At 10 a.m., Calvin got dressed, a process that took him about 30 minutes because he wasn't in any hurry. At 11 a.m., he had a brief meeting with his secretary about the day's schedule. At noon, he had lunch. At 1 p.m., he went to his bedroom, changed into his sleeping pajamas, and went to bed. The reporter waited, and waited, and waited. At 4:15 p.m., Calvin emerged, back in regular clothes. At 4:30, he met briefly with a senator about some minor legislative matter. At 5 p.m., he took a walk around the White House grounds, with Rebecca the raccoon on his shoulder. At 6 p.m., he had dinner with Grace. At 7 p.m., he read in the sitting room. At 8:30 p.m., he went to bed for the night. The reporter's story was essentially, I spent the day with the president and he was asleep for half of it, barely spoke during the other half, and the most exciting thing that happened was a raccoon tried to steal his reading glasses. And America read that story and thought, yeah, that sounds about right. That's our Calvin. But beneath the sleeping, beneath the silence, beneath the carefully cultivated image of passive laziness, Calvin was actually not quite lazy. He was deliberately minimal. There's a difference, and it's an important one. He believed genuinely, deeply believed, that most government action made things worse, that the natural state of America was prosperity and freedom, and the government's job was to not screw that up. So he slept not just because he was tired, but because sleeping meant he wasn't signing bills that expanded government. He stayed silent not because he had nothing to say, but because saying nothing meant not making promises he couldn't keep or wouldn't want to keep. It was passivity as political strategy, inaction as ideology, and for the mid to late 1920s, it seemed to work beautifully. Calvin cut taxes repeatedly, especially for the wealthy and for corporations. He believed that if rich people had more money, they'd invest it, create jobs, and prosperity would trickle down to everyone else. The top marginal tax rate when he took office was 73%. By the time he left, it was 25%. Corporate taxes were slashed. Capital gains taxes were reduced. Revenue to the government went down. But Calvin cut spending to match. He reduced the federal workforce. He trimmed department budgets. He paid down the national debt. Actually paid it down. A thing that almost never happens. Under Coolidge, the government got smaller, leaner, less intrusive, less expensive, and for a while, it seemed like a miracle. The economy boomed, stock prices soared. New technologies, cars, radios, refrigerators, washing machines, were transforming American life. Cities grew, skyscrapers reached higher. It felt like America had cracked the code, found the secret to eternal prosperity. Calvin's philosophy was simple: get the government out of the way and let capitalism work its magic. Don't regulate business. Regulation stifled innovation. Don't tax the wealthy. They were the job creators. Don't expand social programs. That made people dependent on government. Just stay small. stay quiet, stay out of the way. He appointed business-friendly officials to regulatory positions and then basically let them do whatever they wanted. The Federal Trade Commission under Coolidge was toothless. The Securities and Exchange Commission didn't exist yet. Banking regulations were minimal. Companies could do pretty much whatever they wanted, and Coolidge thought that was perfect. But there were cracks. There were always cracks, even if Calvin was too busy sleeping to notice them. Farmers were struggling. Agricultural prices had collapsed after World War I and never recovered. While cities boomed, rural America was in sort of depression. Farmers couldn't pay their mortgages. Small towns were dying. Congress passed bills to help farmers, price supports, loan programs, various forms of agricultural relief. Calvin vetoed them, all of them. That would be government interference in the market. If farming wasn't profitable, then farmers should find other work. That was how capitalism worked. Creative destruction. The market would sort it out. No need for government to pick winners and losers. So farmers kept struggling. Rural banks kept failing. But that was happening far from Washington, far from the cities where most voters lived, far from the stock market parties where fortunes were being made. Easy to ignore when you're asleep half the day anyway. Income inequality was growing. The gap between rich and poor was widening into a chasm. The top 1% of Americans owned an increasing share of the nation's wealth. Workers' wages were stagnating while corporate profits soared. The benefits of the boom weren't being shared. They were concentrating at the top. Calvin didn't care. That was how capitalism worked. Some people were better at business than others. Some people worked harder, took more risks, deserved bigger rewards. The government shouldn't try to equalize outcomes. That would be socialism, practically communism. America was about opportunity, not equality of results. And besides, the stock market was going up. That meant everyone could get rich, right? Just buy some stocks, watch them appreciate, retire wealthy. The American dream was available to anyone willing to participate in the market. Except most Americans couldn't afford to buy stocks. Most Americans were living paycheck to paycheck, with no money left over for investment. The stock market boom was making rich people richer, but it wasn't touching the lives of average workers, farmers, or the poor. But Calvin was asleep, so he didn't notice, or he noticed and didn't care. Hard to tell with Calvin. The stock market itself was becoming increasingly unstable. More and more people were buying stocks on margin, borrowing money to invest, betting that prices would keep going up forever so they could sell at a profit and pay back the loan. Leverage piled on leverage, speculation feeding on speculation. The whole thing was a house of cards, and anyone paying attention could see it. Calvin wasn't paying attention, he was napping. His Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, was one of the richest men in America. Banking, aluminum, oil, investments in everything. Mellon's entire philosophy was what's good for rich people is good for America. He pushed the tax cuts that benefited himself and his wealthy friends. He opposed any regulation of the financial markets. He insisted that the boom would continue indefinitely because it was currently continuing. Calvin trusted Mellon completely. Why wouldn't he? The economy was great, the stock market was soaring, and Calvin could sleep soundly knowing that someone else was handling the details. There were warning signs. Economists who understood what was happening tried to raise alarms. The stock market was overvalued. The speculation was unsustainable. The income inequality was creating a fragile economy where consumer demand couldn't possibly keep up with productive capacity. Something bad was coming. But Calvin had a simple response to concerns. The business of America is business. The market would sort itself out. Government intervention would only make things worse. Best to leave well enough alone. And take a nap. Always time for a nap. In 1927, while on vacation in the Black Hills of South Dakota, Calvin did something that confused everyone in American politics. He called a press conference, but instead of speaking, he handed reporters slips of paper. Each slip had the same sentence typed on it. I do not choose to run for president in 1928. That was it. 12 words, no explanation, no elaboration, no context, just that one cryptic sentence. The reporters were baffled. What did he mean by choose? Was this a definitive no? Or was he saying he didn't choose to run but would accept a draft at the convention? Was this some weird Calvin Coolidge way of saying yes by saying no? They asked for clarification. Calvin refused to elaborate. He'd said what he had to say. 12 words was plenty. Figure it out yourselves. The political world spent months debating what he meant. Newspapers ran endless speculation pieces. Politicians tried to read the tea leaves. Was Calvin really not running? Should they start campaigning for the nomination? Or was this all some elaborate strategy where Calvin would sweep in at the last minute and accept the nomination by popular demand? Grace didn't know what he meant either. Apparently, he hadn't discussed it with her beforehand. Just woke up one day and decided he was done with politics, or maybe done with being president, or maybe just wanted to see if he could confuse everyone with 12 carefully chosen words. Turns out he meant it. He was done. He didn't want to be president anymore. The job had become boring or tiring, or it was interfering too much with his sleep schedule. He'd served most of Harding's term, then his own Saul term. That was enough, more than enough. Time to go home to Massachusetts, sleep in his own bed, not have to deal with the circus of Washington politics. He never fully explained his reasoning. Some historians think it was grief. His son Calvin Jr. had died in 1924 from an infected blister he got playing tennis on the White House courts. Calvin was devastated, as much as Calvin could show devastation. He barely functioned for weeks after the death. Maybe he blamed the presidency somehow, or just couldn't bear to stay in the place where his son had died. Or maybe he was just tired of being president. Maybe he looked ahead to 4 more years of meetings and speeches, and people wanting things from him, 4 more years of having to be awake and present and engaged, and thought, no thank you, I'd rather nap. Whatever the reason, he was done. He endorsed Herbert Hoover, his Secretary of Commerce, who ran on a platform of continuing Coolidge's policies. Hoover won easily. America wanted more of the same, more prosperity, more stock market gains, more government staying out of the way, while capitalism worked its magic. Calvin left office in March 1929 and went back to Northampton, Massachusetts. Bought a modest house called The Beeches, settled into retirement. Probably started sleeping 13 or 14 hours a day now that he had nothing but time. He wrote a brief autobiography that was as minimal and unexpressive as you'd expect from Calvin Coolidge. He wrote a newspaper column for a while, though his columns were famous for being incredibly boring. Just dry recitations of his views on government and economy with no personality whatsoever. He turned down lucrative offers to join corporates, boards, or give speeches. He just wanted to be left alone. Grace finally had him to herself, though I imagine she still had to work around his nap schedule. They'd go for walks, they'd have quiet dinners, they'd read in the evenings, a simple life for a simple man who'd somehow ended up president and had spent his time there doing as little as possible. And then, less than a year after Calvin left office, everything he'd ignored came crashing down. October 1929. The stock market crashed. Not just a correction, a complete collapse. Black Thursday, Black Monday, Black Tuesday, panic selling. Fortunes evaporated. Banks started failing because they'd invested depositors' money in the market. Businesses closed because they couldn't get credit. Unemployment started rising. The Great Depression had begun. Everything that economists had warned about, the speculation, the leverage, the inequality, the fragile foundation of the boom, all came true at once. The house of cards collapsed, and America, which had been partying like it was 1929, because it was 1929, suddenly realised it was broke. Herbert Hoover got blamed for the Depression, which wasn't entirely fair. The conditions had been building for years. The seeds were planted during Coolidge's presidency, the tax cuts that benefited the wealthy, the lack of financial regulation, the refusal to help farmers, the willful blindness to growing inequality and speculation. But Calvin Coolidge, who'd been president during most of the 1920s, who'd presided over the policies that created the bubble, who'd been too busy sleeping to notice the warning signs, he somehow escaped most of the criticism. Maybe because he'd left office before everything collapsed. Maybe because people remembered him fondly as the quiet man who'd left them alone during the good times. Maybe because he was so disconnected from his own presidency that people couldn't really associate him with the policies, or maybe because he'd been so boring, so forgettable in his sleepy passivity that people just didn't think about him much at all. The Roaring Twenties weren't Calvin's era. They happened around him, despite him, while he napped through them. Calvin himself seemed genuinely bewildered by what happened. In one of his rare post-presidency statements, he said something to the effect of, "I don't understand why it happened. Everything seemed fine when I left." "Yeah, Calvin, everything seemed fine because you were asleep." He watched from retirement as the Depression deepened, as unemployment hit 25%, as banks failed by the thousands, as Hoovervilles, shanty towns of homeless people, sprang up in every city, as bread lines stretched around blocks, as the American dream he'd supposedly presided over turned into a nightmare. He never took responsibility for any of it, never acknowledged that maybe his policies of cutting taxes for the rich, refusing to regulate business, and ignoring growing inequality had contributed to the disaster. To be fair, taking responsibility would have required a level of self-reflection and public communication that Calvin had never been capable of. The man who'd said, "The business of America is business," watched as American business collapsed. The man who'd believed government should do nothing watched as people demanded government do something. The man who'd slept through prosperity was now awake to see poverty. And then, in 1933, just a few years into retirement, Calvin's heart gave out. He died suddenly in his home in Northampton, a coronary thrombosis. He was only 60 years old. Grace found him in the morning. He died while lying down, which feels appropriate somehow. His last words had been simple and perfectly Calvin. "Good morning, Robert," said to the man who'd come to help him get dressed for the day. And that was it. The sleepiest president in American history was gone. No dramatic final speech, no deathbed wisdom, no last words of regret or triumph or anything of substance, just a polite greeting to a servant before his heart stopped beating. So what do we make of Calvin Coolidge? How do we understand a man who slept through half his presidency and somehow remained popular during his time in office? Who did as little as possible and was praised for it? Who treated the most powerful office in the world like an inconvenient interruption to his nap schedule? In some ways, Calvin was exactly what America wanted in the 1920s. After the chaos of World War I, after the progressive reforms and government expansion of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, Americans were exhausted. They wanted normalcy. They wanted to be left alone. They wanted a president who wouldn't ask anything of them, who wouldn't demand they sacrifice or change, or think too hard about society's problems. Calvin gave them that. He was the presidential equivalent of elevator music, barely noticeable, inoffensive, easy to ignore. Present, but not really present, a warm body in the Oval Office while America did whatever it wanted. And for a brief moment, for most of the 1920s, it worked. The economy boomed, at least for those who were participating in it. The stock market soared, at least for those who could afford to invest. Life seemed good, at least if you weren't a farmer or a factory worker or part of the growing number of Americans being left behind by the prosperity. But that passivity, that deliberate inaction, that commitment to doing nothing, it had consequences. By refusing to regulate the stock market, Calvin allowed speculation to spiral completely out of control. By refusing to help farmers, he let agricultural depression spread and rural banks fail. By cutting taxes mostly for the wealthy and doing nothing about inequality, he helped create an economy where all the gains went to the top while the foundation crumbled. You can't sleep through problems and expect them to solve themselves. Sometimes you can, briefly, sometimes things work out, despite your absence, but eventually reality catches up. Eventually, the cracks widen into chasms. Eventually, the house of cards collapses. And Calvin wasn't there when it did. He'd already gone back to bed, back to Vermont, back to private life, left Herbert Hoover holding the bag, dealing with the consequences of policies Calvin had championed or passively allowed. It's easy to be mad at Calvin Coolidge, to blame him for the Depression, or at least for helping create the conditions that made it possible, to criticize him for sleeping while Rome burned, or at least while Rome built up an impressive collection of kindling that would eventually catch fire. But there's also something almost admirable about Calvin's commitment to his own nature. He never pretended to be something he wasn't. He never put on a show of false energy or fake enthusiasm. He was quiet, he was sleepy, he was passive, and he made absolutely no apologies for it. In an era of politicians who'll say anything, promise anything, perform any personality that polls well, there's something refreshing about a man who was just himself. Deeply, authentically, stubbornly himself. Even when himself was a taciturn New Englander who'd rather nap than negotiate, his silence had a certain dignity to it. He didn't fill the air with meaningless chatter. He didn't make promises he couldn't or wouldn't keep. He said what needed to be said, and nothing more. In our age of constant noise, constant communication, constant performance, there's something almost zen about Calvin's refusal to participate in the circus. And the sleeping, the legendary, excessive, presidential sleeping, maybe that was honest too. He knew his limitations. He knew that he didn't have answers to every problem. He knew that sometimes the best thing to do was rest, recharge, and let things develop before acting. He just took it to an extreme that probably wasn't healthy for anyone, let alone a president responsible for leading a nation. Grace Coolidge said something interesting about her husband after his death. She said Calvin always felt like he didn't quite belong in the presidency, like he'd stumbled into a role that was meant for someone more dynamic, more eloquent, more engaged. The sleeping, the silence, the withdrawal. Maybe those were ways of managing the profound discomfort of being in a position he never truly wanted. He'd taken the oath of office in his father's sitting room, by lamplight at 2:47 in the morning, and then he'd gone back to bed. Maybe, in a way, he never really woke up from that moment, never fully accepted that he was president, just went through the motions, counted the days, and waited until he could return to the quiet life he actually wanted. There's a photograph from Calvin's presidency that captures something essential about who he was. It shows him sitting alone on the White House porch in a rocking chair. It's afternoon. You can tell from the angle of the light. He's wearing a suit, as always. His hands are folded in his lap. His eyes are closed. He might be napping. He might be thinking. It's impossible to tell the difference with Calvin. Behind him, through the window, you can see White House staff moving around. The machinery of government continuing. People doing their jobs. The executive branch functioning, even though the executive is sitting outside, with his eyes closed, disconnected from it all. That was the Coolidge presidency in one image. The man sitting still while everything else moved around him. Present but absent. Awake but sleeping. President but somehow not quite there. And for a brief moment in American history, that was exactly what people wanted. A president who wouldn't bother them, who wouldn't demand their attention, who'd just sit quietly in his rocking chair, eyes closed, while America did what America was going to do anyway, until it all fell apart, until the alarm finally went off, until someone had to wake up and deal with the mess. But Calvin Coolidge wasn't there for that part. He'd already gone home to Massachusetts, already returned to his quiet life, already resumed his preferred routine of sleeping 11, 12, maybe 13 hours a night with no responsibilities, no demands, no nation depending on him staying awake. He got out just in time. Lucky for him. Not so lucky for everyone else. I want to tell you one more thing about Calvin Coolidge before we finish. After he died, after the funeral and the mourning and the eulogies, someone found a scrap of paper in his desk drawer. It had one sentence written on it in Calvin's handwriting. I feel I no longer fit in with these times. That was it. No date, no context, just that one sad little sentence, a confession or observation hidden away where no one was meant to find it. Maybe he wrote it during the Depression, watching everything he'd believed in collapse around him. Maybe he wrote it before, sensing that something was wrong, but not knowing what or how to fix it. Maybe he wrote it during his presidency, sitting in the White House late at night, surrounded by staff and visitors and obligations, feeling desperately out of place in a role he'd never really wanted. We'll never know. Calvin took that secret to his grave, along with all his other thoughts, all the things he never said, all the opinions he never shared, all the moments when he could have spoken up, could have engaged, could have been more present, and chose silence instead. He slept through his presidency, and in many ways, he slept through history. Just a quiet man from Vermont who somehow became the most powerful person in the world and responded by doing everything he could to avoid exercising that power. He believed that the best government was the government that did the least, that the best president was the president who stayed out of the way, that the best response to most problems was to wait and see if they solved themselves. And for a little, while during the golden glow of the mid-1920s, when prosperity seemed endless and problems seemed distant, that philosophy seemed to work. America wanted to be left alone, and Calvin Coolidge was more than happy to oblige. He'd leave them alone so thoroughly that he'd literally be unconscious for half the day. But the problems didn't solve themselves. The cracks kept growing. The speculation kept building. The inequality kept widening. And when it all came crashing down, when someone needed to actually be present and engaged and leading, Calvin was gone. already back in Vermont, already checked out, already asleep. The alarm went off. The country needed leadership. The crisis demanded attention. And the president, who trained himself to sleep through everything, was no longer there to even try, which, when you think about it, is a pretty good metaphor for America in the 1920s. Everyone was having too good a time to notice that someone should probably be paying attention, that the party couldn't last forever, that eventually you have to wake up and deal with reality. But not Calvin Coolidge. He did his time, minimal as it was, and then he went home. Let someone else figure out what went wrong. Let someone else clean up the mess. Let someone else lose sleep over the consequences of his inaction. He'd done his part, which mostly involved not doing very much at all. The sleepiest president in American history. The man who napped while the world changed around him. The leader who led by not leading. The voice that spoke volumes by saying nothing at all. Calvin Coolidge. Born on July 4th, 1872, in the most American-sounding town in Vermont. Died January 5th, 1933, in his bed, which is where he spent most of his life anyway, President of the United States, from 1923 to 1929, asleep for at least half of it. Maybe more. Champion of small government, low taxes, and leaving people alone. Champion of doing nothing, saying nothing, being nothing but a quiet presence while others did the actual work. Professional sleeper, Olympic-level napper. A man so committed to rest that he made it his entire governing philosophy. And somehow, for a brief golden moment in American history, exactly what the country thought it wanted. We remember him now, when we remember him at all, as a curiosity, a strange footnote in American history. The president who slept, the leader who wasn't really there, the man who proved that sometimes doing nothing is a choice, and not always a good one. But I think Calvin would be okay with that legacy, being remembered as someone who didn't do much, who stayed quiet, who left people alone. That's probably exactly how he'd want to be remembered, if he cared about being remembered at all, which he probably didn't. He'd probably just shrug, if he could be bothered to shrug, and go back to sleep. Sweet dreams, Calvin. You certainly got enough of them. The man who was asleep for half his term. The president who couldn't stay awake. During his own presidency, the leader of the free world who treated leadership like a nap that occasionally got interrupted by actual responsibilities. Calvin Coolidge, the sleepiest president in American history. And now you know his story, the whole drowsy, silent, peculiar story of a man who napped his way through the Roaring Twenties and woke up just in time to miss the crash. The end.